Hello to everyone, and thank you for coming to this Friends of Multilateralism Group, FMG, interview series, MC12 and Beyond. And my name is Xiankun Lu. I'm the CEO of FMG, and today we have the pleasure to have our fellow FMG member, Jonathan, with us, and he is a former ambassador of Canada to the WTO. He was also the chair of dispute settlement and as well as the chair of general counsel. And so today we're going to focus on one key issue of the WTO MC12, the paragraph 3 of the dispute settlement. So Jonathan, thanks for being with us. The first thing is that if you look at it carefully, the article is paragraph 4 actually on the dispute settlement. For me, there are 3 key points. The first thing is that acknowledgement of the challenges and concerns related to dispute settlement, including our appellate body. The second thing, recognition of the importance and the urgency of addressing these challenges and concerns. And last point, more interestingly, a commitment to conduct discussions and with a view to having a fully and a well-functioning dispute settlement system accessible to all members by 2024. So there's a deadline here. So this is a short paragraph, but with a lot of things, substance there. So my first question to you, what's your evaluation of this outcome and how important it is for the dispute settlement system and also the appellate body crisis? Yeah.
Well, Lou, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be participating in FMG among so many other experts, and no doubt collectively the views will be much wiser than me alone. So I look forward to other interviews and other discussions on the subject. Look, I think it's important to put this paragraph on dispute settlement in the context of the overall results. And of course, there are many opinions on the outcome of MC12. I think it's fair to say that they're probably all correct in the sense that some would say the results are very modest, that some of the hoped for outcomes were watered down, and thus the WTO is still failing to meet the challenges of the 21st century. There are others who say this is remarkable in a time of heightened tensions and differences between East and West and North and South, that a consensus was still able to be had on subjects of very immediate importance: trade and health, trade and the environment as reflected in the fisheries agreement, and so on. I guess I would say run the counterfactual, as our economist colleagues would love to say. The WTO was frankly in intensive care and at the risk of dying. And the doctors of the stakeholders and shareholders of the international community have saved the life of the WTO to live another day. But to be frank, I think the WTO, to carry on the medical analogy, may still be in critical condition. And that means it requires continued care and attention to bring further health and vibrancy to the organization. So despite some of these immediate results, and we can touch on some of the other areas, the real test will be the earnestness and sincerity with which the membership carries forward some of the promises for further discussion. And there, no doubt, due to the exigencies of timing and the challenges of the politics surrounding the discussions, the mechanisms for carrying those discussions are not very clear. In effect, everything was handed back to the General Council. Ministerial oversight only occurs in formal fashion at the next ministerial. So key will be not only what discussions unfold in Geneva, but the care and attention, as I said earlier, that will be given to the WTO and its future health by capitals and by ministers between now and the next ministerial. And that's particularly true on dispute settlement. So that's my overall context. The issues that have plagued the dispute settlement system have been accumulating over many years and in various dimensions. Let's not forget that there had been, for well close to 20 years, a dispute settlement body in special session, as it's called, a negotiating group to update the dispute settlement understanding. And it was bogged down year after year as they began to look at each of these various dimensions and to try and sort out whether there was a consensus for further refinement and further reform. And no agreement was reached. So hidden in this general paragraph lies a host of issues, many of long standing, while the media and much of the public attention is on the fact that the appellate body has ceased to function. Well before the appellate body issue, you have a range of issues that plague the panel process and the decision-making process. And let me just illustrate a few. What is the standard of review for panels in reviewing the administration and application of domestic law that is meant to implement WTO obligations? That's particularly pronounced in trade remedy cases and anti-dumping, and even more specifically, the specific issue known as zeroing in terms of the methodology used in calculating whether dumping has occurred and what the margin of dumping might be. The issue of judicial economy, as the lawyers like to call it, whether panels and the appellate body should be exercising judicial restraint in terms of deciding only the case before it, or in the interests of certainty and predictability, providing their best view on what this may mean on future similar cases in a system that explicitly is not designed to have binding precedent as another issue, for example. So all of which is to say the discussions that need to unfold even on a technical basis will be complex, will be multifaceted, and again, because of the interests at stake, will necessarily need to involve capital-based officials as well as Geneva officials. More fundamentally, the real underlying issue, and it's hidden, I think, in paragraph 4, is what is the nature of the dispute settlement system? And here I put emphasis on the word system. And let me just take 1 or 2 more minutes to look at the architecture of the Marrakesh agreements. Recall, and the previous US administration was fond of reminding us, that under the GATT, so-called working parties of the contracting parties were there to offer, in effect, almost a conciliator's view. Here's our best advice. Here's the considerations that should motivate the parties to find a mutually agreed solution. And of course, any such decision of that dispute settlement process could be vetoed by one party. Coming out of the Uruguay round, that was turned on its head. Faced with the threat of unilateralism, particularly by the United States under its domestic 301 procedure, that with a timetable of 1 year said if they're not satisfied, they will reserve the right to take unilateral action. A dispute settlement procedure was designed ostensibly to take place within that same 1-year period, to reach a decision that would be therefore multilateral in nature rather than unilateral in nature. And that decision would hold unless there was a consensus not to accept the decision. So the unilateral veto was turned on its head. But at the end of the day, the negotiators of the Uruguay round and the WTO agreements did not create, in technical terms, an independent judiciary. So people use the analogy of an executive and legislative and judicial branch. That's not quite what the WTO is. Any decision of a panel, and ultimately the appellate body, has no standing whatsoever unless and until the membership itself adopts it. And thus the final authority of what the jurisprudence and rulings would be is not an appellate body, not a panel, but the membership. And to some extent, the membership itself collectively has abdicated its responsibility to take its own serious look as to whether it agrees or disagrees in whole or in part with one or more decisions of panels and appellate bodies. I tried during my chairmanship of the dispute settlement body to nurture and invite more meaningful discussion at the DSB regarding the members' own assessments of panel reports and appellate body reports. I admit to not having succeeded very much in nurturing that. Let me go to the other extreme, which is the start of the process. And here, I think we've collectively not paid enough attention to this. As I said a few minutes ago, the ultimate goal of a dispute settlement system is to settle the dispute, a mutually agreed dispute. In domestic law, a lawyer is not only successful by winning court cases, but by staying out of court and negotiating a settlement. And thus you have built into the system a first stage, which says if you've got a difference, the first thing to do, aside from the notifications and discussions in normal committee process or in special processes such as special trade concerns in SPS and so on, is to consult. And that, in its original intent, was meant to be a genuine effort to sit down as negotiators rather than as litigators to sort out whether there are areas of agreement, potential compromise, and so on to reach a solution. Unfortunately, what has evolved is the legalization of that stage to the point where consultations are used more to restate positions, to discover weaknesses or further details of the opposite side's case, and to prepare for litigation. So we collectively need to explore, and I think this is part of what's intended in paragraph 4, more meaningfully the start of the process too, how to nurture, even before ending up in a panel or an appellate level, how we can better foster the possibility of mutually agreed outcomes. In the middle, you have the process itself, and there's a host of issues there. The volumes of pleadings, for example, the nature of the hearing process, the role of third parties, the transparency of the process, and whether outside views beyond governments can be accepted into the process. The role of general international law and of other treaties, for example, environmental obligations, health obligations, and so on, that need to be factored in. So at each stage in the process, consultation, the litigation process itself, and the determination of the legitimacy and accuracy of the outcome from these quasi-judicial bodies are all at issue. So going back to where I started, if the proof is in the pudding, and we can't give a thumbs up or thumbs down to MC12 overall until we see what the follow-up looks like, I do hope that discussions on the dispute settlement system are comprehensive, aren't unduly focused solely on the appellate body alone, and do look at it as a system. Final word, and I know I've talked for too long, the appellate body itself, the appointments process, the question of a renewable term versus one longer term, for example, the criteria to be applied if there is to be a renewal, and so on, all have been issues along the way as well. So a very full agenda. There is a notional deadline, but let's face it, in many areas, WTO negotiators have failed to reach agreement within deadlines. I'm old enough to have been a participant in the Montreal ministerial meeting of 1986, was it? And that was labeled a midterm review of the Uruguay round. And obviously it took 1988, sorry, and that was 2 years after the launch because it was supposed to take 4 years. Well, it took an additional 3. So that deadline was not reached, and several others along the way missed as well. So 2024, always good to have a deadline. It will spur some work. It doesn't guarantee success within that period.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And to take up your last point, the thing is that, as you said, the Uruguay round failed its midterm deadline. But the good thing at that moment is that in a few years later, they managed to finish the round and establish the WTO. So this time we have 2024 ahead of us. Maybe we could miss it, but if we could at least establish a kind of dialogue to discuss both at the technical level and also the political level, as you have described, leading to some foundation, even for something beyond 2024 would already not be a bad thing. I just hope they could deliver on that. But one thing on this, that's technical level, all these things you have mentioned about appellate body itself, about the hearings, about third party, everything, more or less through the David Walker process, a lot of things, ideas were put on the table for the US to consider. And then technical level, there were also some discussions, but members still remain curious about what is the purpose of the US. As you said, some experts put it bluntly, do they really want to go back to the GATT system? As you have said, that kind of unilateral veto could kill any judgment. But all the other thing is that you just need to re-establish a better system that it could still bring the binding dispute settlement system, including the appellate body, into the function. So those are the things people are still asking. So with this, what do you think about the way forward? I mean, the way forward means that how do we carry forward both these two levels of discussion, political level and technical level? How could we bring them together, connect them together, and so as to understand the purpose of the US and concerns of others, and then to bring us forward? What was your view for the future?
Well, far be it from old people like me to pontificate to the current very expert crowd responsible. But there's an old saying in English, of course, he who doesn't read history is doomed to repeat it. And the very first step is to accumulate the facts. And thus, while there's reams of material, both from government sources and negotiators and a number of very erudite outside scholars and observers, if there are some way of expeditiously consolidating and synthesizing the ideas, as you said, that have been on the table and that have been explored so as to be aware not only of what the issues have been, but what's been tried and is unlikely to succeed, what's been tabled but not fully explored, so that you build from a base rather than starting with a blank piece of paper. To give one illustration, during my time, which is now almost 10 years old at the WTO, because of the impasse that was already emerging then and some of the frustrations about litigation, Canada and a number of other like-minded countries initiated discussions on what we called at that time practice notes, that those users of the system who have experienced good and bad things about the process might, and the WTO rules allowed for this, have a menu of options from which to choose to apply to their particular case. So the disputing parties might readily agree, based on a practice note that would sort out the details in advance, that we agree our procedure will be transparent and will be open. Or we might agree to file our pleadings concurrently rather than in sequence. Or we might agree to page limits so as not to overly legalize the process. And it attracted a good deal of interest and attention. It didn't quite take hold, but that remains an option. Similarly, and most recently, and although I pleaded 10 years ago for this to happen, it only occurred recently, take the Philippines versus Thailand on customs tariff applying to tobacco, a long-standing dispute. Two neighbors in the ASEAN region. And ultimately, finally, through the good offices of the current Australian ambassador, they agreed to use the good offices procedure set out in the WTO as an option along the way further to consultations to reach a mutually agreed solution. So there's another example of recent and past practice that can help inform how to shape some of the reforms going forward. Might you explore, in that example, a more affirmative obligation to explore good offices and other alternate dispute settlement options before racing to the door of the panel process, whether it's the Director General exercising good offices or a friendly ambassador, such as Australia did in this case, are good examples. So step one, it seems to me, is to accumulate the corpus of experience and analysis, including the records of the DSB in special session. Step two, as I said earlier, if the entire framework of the MC12 outcome document is it all goes to the General Counsel. And remember that, if I can put it this way, constitutionally, the DSB is an emanation of the General Counsel. So does the DSB take ownership? Do you need to recreate a DSB in special session as a negotiating table? You inevitably will have caucuses. You and I both have similar information that the United States has begun some small group discussions. There will be friends of the system, as there have been, frequent users of the system. The developing countries have long had a view that the system, by over-legalizing and by engaging expensive counsel, is prejudicial to their interests. The Advisory Center on WTO law may have views to offer. So what kind of stakeholder consultations might also be engaged? Former appellate body members. There's a huge community of experienced panelists around the world. And of course, many scholars, both of law and WTO policy, from around the world as well. And we should not blind ourselves to their input and analysis along the way. I assume that would be assisted, since it is in the outcome document, by the Directorate for Legal Affairs and John Adank as General Counsel to serve the members in gathering this. And then the missing piece of all of that, even if it's Geneva-centric, not to repeat the point too many times, is how do you engage the capital-based people in that process. Then it's really up to the DSB or the DSB in special session to see if there's a chair, to see if you can disaggregate some of the issues, have dedicated tables on subsets. One group might be a working party specifically focused on the appellate body issues, one on the panel process, one on the consultation stage. And lest we forget, and I take this from Catherine Tai's very enlightening interview, to look at the systemic issues, the consultation phase, how to nurture a system that points to outcomes. So there are ways of organizing. I would simply say gratuitously, it should be methodical. It should build on the record and disaggregate rather than trying to talk about everything at once, all at the same table.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I also heard that the U.S. delegation under the instruction by Catherine Tai has started a small group process discussing with other members, which is of course a good sign. And I heard also even small group, but this is also quite include the, let's say, the major players, including the big ones, but also smaller ones who are very much attached to the dispute settlement system. I also like one point which is related to this Geneva process is that you do need to engage capital-based officials because, as you described earlier, many things behind this are more political and relate to domestic system and related to domestic politics. So that's a very key point. But the other thing I want to say, ask you about, because how do we relate to this to the broader context of the WTO function, the WTO reform? Because the same interview you have said by Catherine Tai, she tried to allude this to the broader context, a much bigger vision, not only appellate body as related to the whole dispute settlement system, but also the dispute settlement system to other key functions like negotiation, like, in her words, the larger vision for reinvigorating the WTO. So I think that's also a key point we should not lose sight of. Probably you could also elaborate a little bit on that and share as your views. Thank you.
Well, as usual, Lou, you and I vigorously agree. And look, it's a bit of a conundrum because I think Catherine Tai is accurate in saying dispute settlement is and has to be placed in context. You don't design a dispute settlement system unless you know what it is you're trying to settle disputes about. So in union employer relations, it had long been settled, but fitting the circumstances, that tripartite arbitration with a labor and a management and an independent representative was the way to go. And that suits those circumstances. Well, what is it you're trying to settle disputes about? And we know that we have a system that's designed to cover a range of issues, sometimes with specialized expertise. There are some rules, sometimes disputed, about whether panelists can bring in experts of their own accord or as requested by experts, requested by the parties, for example, on science or other technical aspects. So you have to be aware of what it is you're trying to do. I take as a given, and Catherine Tai has said this as well, the ultimate goal is, to borrow from peace and security terms, the peaceful settlement of disputes, or in WTO terms, a mutually acceptable, mutually agreed solution. that takes you back to looking at how to reinvigorate the consultation phase and how to tie that to whether the committee system, the notification system, even the trade policy review is doing its job in clearing the air, in highlighting well in advance of a potential adversarial dispute that there's a real difference of views that's percolating, and that early attention may avoid more serious differences. So that takes you back to the General Council and its 13 different, or now 14 different committees, and whether the notification procedures are honored too much in their breach, and whether they've become too complex, and whether they're way out of date in terms of the responsiveness of members in providing timely notifications, and so on. So to some extent, even a dedicated work program on paragraph 4 needs to be tied into how the membership is looking at improving the existing functioning of the WTO at the front end. At the back end, again, you want to ensure that there's a common understanding as to the status and stature of a panel or an appellate body report. Ultimately, it's there for the settlement of that dispute. Some scholars have said the appellate body was noble in its intention in its early years by offering volunteering views beyond the case as sort of advance guidance, because nobody knew what these new WTO rules meant. Now, the prevailing view is stick to your knitting, stick to the case, and don't volunteer in a civil law tradition too much doctrine for the future. So I think I respect Catherine Tai's urging that we be explicit and conscious of the context at the front end and at the back end as well. And in that context, as I said, good offices is an example. Article 25, a general arbitration provision, that is yet another option. You need to look at all the flexibilities that are built in and how to support more creative thinking by capitals, even though there's no doubt domestic stakeholder pressure that you've got to fight to the finish. You've got to raise every conceivable argument, whether it has merit or not, or else you're not adequately defending us, to say, no, ultimately what we want is certainty and predictability without constantly being caught up in litigation on how trade should work. Footnote, maybe trade remedies deserve special and unique attention. And maybe that's another sub-table to be had, because as I said earlier, dumping cases in particular, and some subsidies cases, and the standard of review and the complexity of domestic law that's being applied have been of particular concern to a certain number of members. What I don't think you can afford to do is to say, well, the WTO agreements read well. It talks about consultation. It talks about good offices. It's all there. Well, we're not making it happen. We're not following through on the language. So are there ways to make this an operational reality? So we come back to the notion that with capital-based participation as well, the discussion needs to be a mix of law and policy in following through on paragraph 4.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. The things process about consultations, TPR, and also various councils and committees, including notifications, and also previously about good offices, arbitration on this, is more like what we call it soft power of the system. some committees or councils do well, like we discussed the TPDSBS. They resolve many things before the case was brought anywhere into the judicial system. But there are some others which are not there yet. So that's what we need to build upon. About the case, the status of panel and appellate board reports, especially about the panelists or the appellate board members going beyond what they were supposed to do. This is, of course, one of the major concerns of the US. And that's also why I think Catherine Tai is related to this is to broaden the negotiating function, that you cannot, get something you cannot get out of the negotiation. So I think those are the nuances behind this. The final point, what you said is about the trade remedies. I think you are talking about the zeroing, and which is becoming very political. So that's also on the table, but this has to be in the whole big plate with many other things together. So you cannot resolve zeroing by resolving the dispute itself.
Yeah, but here's the conundrum, and it's with all respect to Catherine Tai. And that is, it's fine as far as it goes to say we need to put things into context, we need to better understand the system overall. Neither you or I are privy to this small group set of discussions that's begun. So I don't know what's being said on the inside. But for the general membership, I think it's fair to say that the United States is yet to articulate in any form any more specifics of their thinking in this context. And as a key player, we need to hear that and understand that. And pleas have been made over the last several years, and the last couple of years in particular, for the US just to say, in more positive terms, here's what we'd like to see, and here's some examples, rather than just saying no, or now, oh, well, let's talk about it, right? And in effect, the cynic would say that's all you have in paragraph 4, and it's an agreement to talk.
Yeah, so which means that be it the small group process initiated by the US or the bigger process under Article 4 of the outcome document should be more or less a kind of a two-way interaction, so that members will bring their concerns, and the US should also try to provide more articulate, as you said, their concerns, but also potential options to resolve this. I think that's the thing. Yeah.
Well, and overall, the outcome document emphasizes inclusiveness and transparency. If you do too much in a small group, too much in a green room, and not engage in a meaningful way the views of the membership more broadly, you're inviting trouble later on. So, yes, is the short answer in terms of people coming forward with ideas, and that includes the United States, China, India, and just about anybody else who's got experience in the system.
Yeah, that's a key legitimacy issue. Anything, a small group or informal process enhance efficiency, but you need to legalize it by bringing it to the more inclusive or transparent process, like informal house or the general council meeting, so on and so forth, that others could also participate and build up their ownership on that. So maybe one final thing is that, of course, we have a process now ahead with a deadline 2024, which is doubtful, but at least it's a good start. And also, as we said, we have informal consultations also going on. But looking ahead, be it a formal process, informal one, what would be your last message to the members from you as an expert, or from us as a civil society group, and the last message to them, so as they could deliver and they really bring back this dispute settlement system and make sure that this crown, this jewel of the crown, would continue to shine. Yeah, please.
Well, I go back to where we started, and that is, while there's a natural tendency to be self-congratulatory, that there's more than meets the eye, that this actually has been in MC12 a great success. As I said, I think we're still at a very critical stage for the future of a multilateral framework, as opposed to a framework that becomes fragmented through the various plurilateral and other agreements, which should be complementary rather than a replacement. And what that means is you can't sit on your laurels and then say, it's already June and it'll take well into the fall to regroup after summer holidays, which are traditional in Europe. And then soon enough, you're into the annual rotation of chairmanships. So you run the risk of almost losing a year, up to a year before you actually get organized. So if it is as fragile, and if we are still in critical condition, and if the future is still potentially impacted by geopolitics, by war, by competition over technology and forms of economic organization and so on, we can't afford just to sit back. We should take a workmanlike, methodical, but early start to the follow-up work that's required. And that's not the responsibility of the Director General, that's the responsibility of the members. So a good deal rests in capitals to keep things moving, is my simple advice.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And to conclude with that, the paragraph 4 did has a word of urgency. So I think that the members who have agreed to it really mean it, and by not losing any time ahead of us.
But sorry to interrupt, but recall that as early as 2016 in the G20, they said the WTO is falling short, and that was agreed by China and the United States and every other G20 member, including India. And it is an urgent matter to address. So here's the world's leadership saying that, 6 years ago, that it was urgent. So nice to see it reiterated. Let's hope that it's acted on more urgently. So.
Yeah, let's continue to ring that bell and hope for the best.
Well said.
Okay. So with that, I will conclude this session interview, and also I thank you very much, Jonathan, for being with us and sharing so many interesting insights. But also thank the audience for bearing with us, and we look forward to next time we'll go deeper, of course, with a broader panel and then to discuss all these things. So thank you very much, and see you.
An honor, as I said at the outset. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.